my spiritual journey right now is definitely not traditional. I'm not attending church, any specific church at the moment, but I like to think of it as, especially as a scientist, there's a lot of things we don't know about the universe. What started this Big Bang and this ball rolling, and what powers are sort of like controlling the energetics of the universe. And it's those are the larger questions, but at the end of the day, I think it's a fellowship and a love amongst fellows who are going through similar things, and love of family. And those are the sort of the foundations of my spiritual journey right now.
Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys, the podcast of great conversations with men. I'm your host, Chris Foster, and we're going to explore how we wear this beautiful and confusing mantle of manhood in the 21st century. Look, I get it. In public life, a lot of men are knuckleheads. But in private life, we can be thoughtful and we can be reflective if we have the right conversation, if we feel comfortable talking about our story. And we all have a great story to tell. And we can all learn from those stories. We can learn about who we've been, who we are, and who we want to be. And that's why we're going to have this conversation, so we can learn from other men just like us. And we're going to learn today from my friend Scott. Scott is a scientist. And early on in his life, at that pivotal moment of teenagerhood, a big torpedo came in and rocked that whole family structure and set aside, his perspectives of certainty and uncertainty in a completely different way. Might have impacted the choices he made his whole life. And as he got through adulthood and midlife tension, those kinds of uncertainty revealed themselves again. And how he handled them is brilliant and brave. And I think we can learn a lot how he figures out the science of uncertainty in his life moving forward. I'm so glad you're here to listen to this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys. So, Scott Sutton, welcome in.
It's great to be here, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah, my name is Scott Sutton, and I was born in Boulder, Colorado in 1964, a long time ago. We moved around a lot when I was young, so I mostly grew up in Pittsburgh, PA, and Boise, Idaho. Currently, I live in San Diego with my wife and 2 cats. I have 2 adult children. One is just about to finish with college, and another finished college a couple of years ago, and they're both doing really well. So I'm a dad and an empty nester right now, which has been really interesting. I'm a chemist by training. I got my PhD at UC Davis, and I've been working for a large pharmaceutical company for quite some time.
Excellent. So one thing that's interesting that I discovered about you is that we have something in common. A, we both grew up in Pittsburgh for a time, and B, that both of our parents had divorced. So why don't we start there, Scott? What are your memories of your family kind of before and after that event?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the contrast of my family life before and after that event is quite stark. I remember in Pittsburgh growing up, there was a time that my dad was making, decent money. We were in a sort of a lower middle class neighborhood called Wilkinsburg. And my mom decided it was time to take some time off of her work. She was a public school teacher, and my dad was a statistician. to stay at home and be with the kids. And I remember that time fondly because I felt very cared for and loved. And, every day mom was home when I came home from school. And it was just a pretty idyllic early childhood. I remember my dad taking my sister and I down to the field, Turner Field, locally there, and teaching us how to play baseball, to hit and catch balls. And I was a big Pirates fan back then, still am. And and so and we would, as a family, we would always say, you know, we are a team, or we are going to always stick together, and that was our motto growing up. So at the time my parents split, I was 13 and we were living in Boise, Idaho at that time. I was really blindsided. I did not see it coming. And after that event, um, the family life took a turn for the worse, I would say, from my perspective. My dad was pretty much out of the picture. He had some mental health issues that started right after the divorce, and he really wasn't in my life much. I saw him maybe a couple of times a year. Um,
Hmm.
and my mom was the breadwinner and caretaker. And shortly after the divorce, she met another man that she fell in love with and married him. My stepfather. I never really considered him a stepfather. He was a cowboy. There are cowboys in Idaho, and he's kind of a real life cowboy kind of guy, truck driver, auto mechanic. And he brought his dog and his old junker cars into our life. And I had a dog at the time named Rocket, and Rocket and his dog would fight. We had to keep them separate.
Oh no.
It was that was symbolic of this unwanted presence of this man and his dog coming into my house. Um, and I reacted to that in a pretty rebellious way. I do remember my parents asking me if I wanted to go see a counselor. And in hindsight, I think that would have been a good idea. But I didn't understand at the time, 13, 14-year-old, how that could help me. And so I
Mm-hmm.
refused that help. Um, so it wasn't like they weren't there to help me. They did make some offers, but I went into this sort of like, I call it a free range childhood mode, where
Mm.
I started taking care of myself and being really independent. Got a job at a restaurant, and you know had some pretty wild times back then.
It's interesting. So you're 13, 14. So my folks split when I was 5. So I actually didn't have a clear memory of a life without that dynamic. I have, probably emotional memories of, all of us being together. But I even remember at second grade, like writing a prompt about, divorce and blah, blah, blah. And it was a different thing because, going to different houses and different times. My salient memories of Christmas, for example, was being dropped off at East Liberty Lutheran Church at the Christmas Eve service, because I would go from one house to the next at those moments. Right? It's a really powerful thing, and I think that parents don't quite know or can prepare their children for that kind of torpedo in a family life. And it's interesting, you mentioned this idyllic family life in Wilkinsburg, Pittsburgh. Strange but true. I actually lived right next door to Wilkinsburg in a little neighborhood called Regent Square. If anyone knows Pittsburgh, they're cousins, right? They're neighborhoods that are separated only by Braddock Avenue. And then in Boise, a completely different landscape, a completely different world. You suddenly found yourself in a completely different world. And it's interesting, you just said that you became more independent. And instead of kind of living in this sheltered life where your mom was caretaker, you probably felt like not only did you get pushed out, but like Rocket, you had to kind of fight a little bit about what was happening and choose another path.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I grew up faster than I think most kids. Um, and Boise, Idaho was a place where, and it was a time when kids were allowed to ride their bikes to school. And I remember having a motocross motorcycle, and I had some friends at the restaurant who also rode motorcycles, and we would just go riding in the hills together
Mm.
and have these great adventures. We would go fishing and on the Snake River, just as independent teenagers. No parents around. There were drugs involved. I smoked a lot of pot back in those days and experimented with LSD and mushrooms and maybe once or twice cocaine. Um, and the restaurant environment was sort of conducive to, hanging out afterwards and staying up late and partying with friends. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a very interesting time. Um, I think if I could go back again and do it all over again, I would make different choices. But it was those were formative years, and I'm just glad I survived without going to the hospital or even worse.
But they are formative years, right? Because it also shows. I think in those years you see a life that you could lead, but there was something innate about you knowing that that was not the life you wanted to pursue as an adult, right? And I think that every teenager could and should have some kind of healthy dose of some kind of rebellion.
Hmm.
I think that that's actually good because you experiment with different lives and different ways to live in a relatively safer environment. And it's interesting because you said that your dad was out in of the picture ish and kind of saw him a couple times a year. And I remember this one moment when I was older. And my dad he was around, right? I mean, it's not like he was absent, but I do remember he picked me up one time. I was about 16, 17, and my mom was out of town, and he was picking me up for the weekend. And I said, "Oh, come on!" And I came into the house. He didn't ever really ever come into my mom's house, right? Which is where we lived all the time. And so he came in and came up and came into my room, and he looked around and he goes, I miss so much of your life. And it really landed hard to me. And I was like, I don't know what to say to that because that wasn't my fault, right? That was not me. That was the situation that you guys created. And I don't know if it's different for boys or for girls, but I saw my dad in a completely different light in that moment. I saw him as a man who missed out. And I'll talk about it later about what a profound impact that had on me in my
Hmm.
fatherhood experience balancing career. But how did your relationship with your mom and your dad change, especially when Cowboy came in?
Yeah. I think my relationship with my mom changed a lot. I lost some respect for my mom, which is hard to say now because that respect was regained many-fold as we went through life together, and she's still with us. But I did lose some respect. I remember one day, um, we had this Volkswagen uh, hatchback that she would drive us to school in occasionally, and she was at a time in her life when balancing career, a family, a new husband, and she would sometimes eat her breakfast on the way to school, like bring actually a bowl of cereal into the car and kind of eat it while she was driving. And she she spilled the bowl of cereal, and as she spilled it, she swerved into a parked Cadillac, And, a Volkswagen versus a Cadillac is like no comparison, right? Um,
Right.
my head went, this is back in the day, we weren't wearing seatbelts. My head went and hit the windshield,
Oh.
cracked the windshield, but I was okay. But it was maybe that little story is symbolic of, I didn't feel protected. I felt like I was kind of surviving along with everything else that was going on, and even though mom was providing food and shelter and doing all the basics, there was this sense of, yeah, man, I'm on my own, or I'm going to be on my own very, sooner than I think. And
Hmm.
so that's that. You asked about my dad, so I'll switch to that next. He he was trying to make his way in the world and struggling along, and we did have some bonding moments. I remember he left his role as a statistician and tried various things, including farming. I think my headphones just crapped out, so I'm going to take them off. Can you still hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So my dad, he we had some bonding moments. He started this office furniture business, and we installed some office furniture in Wyoming, of all places. And so we had a few bonding moments, but they were far and few between. Um, and that was pretty much what characterized that period of my relationship with him.
Now, that was a challenging time as you were a youth trying to figure yourself out. You had a new home dynamic and in a new home environment. Your relationship with your mom, which was, I think, a real anchor point in Pittsburgh, became less so, right? In Boise. As you went through the decades and as you got older, how did your
Mhm.
relationship with your dad change? Did he ever reconcile or be able to address his mental health challenges?
He did. He ended up, stabilizing his mental health challenges, and we went through long periods of talking about reconciliation and acknowledging that a healing need to occur between us. And I think we made it maybe halfway to that end point before he passed away. Um,
Mm,
and I would actually put most of the blame on my resistance as a son, um, not making it to full reconciliation before he passed. I think he was doing his best and trying very hard. He was a bit of a narcissist, and maybe unaware of that aspect of himself, not very self aware of that. And so my sister and I talk about him a lot before and after he died. And I think that, I was holding back um, for various reasons, maybe resentments that I had, and um, maybe also a little bit of not respecting the path that he took, although at the same time forgiving him, because mental illness is, I've experienced depression, and I know how debilitating that can be. So at the same time, forgiving him for his failings, um, I never really fully reconciled with him, and
mm.
the troubled childhood that I had, and that's hard to say right now. But yeah,
It
go
is
ahead.
hard, right? Because there's, people talk a lot about fatherhood, but not too many people talk about sonhood.
Hmm.
right? The act of being a son and the journey of being a son, and how you um, are a son to your father when you're an adult. And I think that, you know, forgiving, well, I mean, we hear it on Sundays, right? Forgive our trespasses if we forgive those who trespass against us, right? That's one of the things where, only as you get older do I think you can look at your parents as people rather than as parents,
Hmm.
right? As individuals in and of themselves. And I think that that's very hard, especially when you look at each parent separately, because for children of divorce, they suddenly have separate relationships with their parents. For families, yes, they have people have separate relationships, but then there's also the relationship to the marriage and the married couple of mom and dad. When they split, that third relationship goes away, and there's only the one-on-one relationship. And so I think that that's a lot harder to have reconciliations, because suddenly, as a youngster, you're asked to have a mature relationship with a mature person.
Yeah, I remember. That's interesting. You said that because I remember one of the reconciliation vacations I had with my father is we rented a Airbnb on Whidbey Island up in Seattle, which was where close to where he was living at the time. And the purpose of that trip for me was to hang out with my dad, have some fun, have a couple of beers, and just hang out. And I wanted to ask him about, his side of the divorce, which I'd gotten various snippets through the years, but I really wanted to have plenty of time to learn, what was going on with him at the time. And I think what I learned a couple of things. I learned that he felt that he wasn't being satisfied, sexually as a man with the relationship with my mom, um, and yet and yet he had cheated a couple of times on her, um,
Mm,
and that was the main reason for the divorce. But I just in terms of how I handled my marriage, I both my wife and I are children of divorce, and we wanted to make sure that that didn't happen in our family, and we worked extra hard,
right.
not to let.
Yeah. No, I get you. I get you. Yeah, that's a thing where, you want to have those breakthrough conversations, but there are some times in some relationships where it just never happens.
Yeah, yeah, and the fact that he was putting more of the blame on my mom at the time, um, it didn't quite ring as true. So I've heard both sides of the story, right? And they're slightly
Mm-hmm.
different, which is understandable because we're all sort of living in our own reality, and sometimes um, the reality is not a perfect recording of history, right? Or at least our brains don't record it perfectly. Um,
That's right.
so I think that those are some of the reasons that I never got to full reconciliation. But the one thing I want to stress and remind everybody listening is there was always love in our family, a tremendous amount of love, and
Mm-hmm.
I never felt unloved or um, discarded or set aside or anything like that. And so that's a very grounding. I know some people who have gone through much worse than me, and still
Mm-hmm.
came out the other end. So you know, for me, it was a very strengthening period, and I think it launched me into my senior year of high school. I took different decisions. With a friend, I decided to quit smoking pot altogether and got really serious about my life, and that led to an amazing career that I'm just so fortunate to have.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And I think that a grounding of love um, gives kids confidence and gives them an emotional safety net. Even if the dynamics might not be the way we want, if there's a safety net of love, that goes a long way for helping to then stabilize a kid and getting him or her ready for the next stage.
Right. Yeah, you're so right, Chris.
We'll be right back. So, Scott, then you left high school, got serious, and embarked on what turned out to be a stellar career. Clearly, you have a powerful intellect. But I'm curious about what you just mentioned, where memory can be deceiving. Life is uncertain, reality is a little bit uncertain. Clearly, you had this moment of deep uncertainty in these formative years. Science, however, can be a place of relative, sure, there's uncertainty in the exploration, but in the end of the day, there's a science to it, right? There is a chemical reaction. There is a thing that actually works and can be predicted. When did you start getting really interested in science?
Yeah. I remember, so my first year of college was in Boise, Idaho. And, you have to declare a major as you start that journey. I was torn between declaring a major in music and science. I knew that I had an interest in science from a pretty early age. And, I was heavily influenced by that show that some of you may remember, The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. And it
Yes.
began my love of the ocean pretty early on. And I did a scuba diving trip that first year of college, and I was just enthralled by the ocean. And so that kind of led to a question of, well, maybe I should be a marine biologist. So I started my major as marine biology, and then I took a geology class and started becoming interested in geology. But then I took organic chemistry after transferring to University of Washington. So this would be my sophomore year, and I fell in love with the science of organic chemistry. There was something about those structures that you could draw on paper that were really appealing to me, that from then on, it was like a certainty that that's what I wanted to do with my life. Um, so it was, taking that class and having a really outstanding professor um, at the University of Washington that taught that first class. And, from then on, it was just like full immersion. I pretty much just, studied all the time and really, really loved organic chemistry and got through and, got my degree.
Yeah. Do you think that the structural component of it is, something you've always loved? Do you think that might have been heightened by those years of uncertainty where your life was seemingly unstructured?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question that I haven't given much thought. Um, I certainly love the structure of science. Um, there is a lot of uncertainty in what I do in terms of the R&D component. We often try things that we don't know if they're going to work. We design routes on paper. We don't know if we'll ever get to the end, and so there's some uncertainty with what I do, and I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that uncertainty, and
Mm.
especially in my early years, um, we often have competing ideas at work because we work in teams. And so sometimes you have to advocate for your own idea, even though you're not 100% certain it's going to work out. But I've learned over the years to, that to rely on successes and failures that I've had and use that experience to be able to predict pretty well these days whether something's going to work out or not. So I don't know. I don't know if that's an answer to your question or if I'm going into other realms,
Well,
but
I think it's no, that's great because I think you had mentioned that you're early on in your career you were less comfortable with uncertainty. Now you're maybe a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty because of your previous track record of creating structure and certainty in uncertain situations. But I think some of these formative experiences go deep into our brain, right? This amygdala hippocampus part of our brain is memory and long term emotion, and they're physiologically right next to each other. And so I think we have these things that stick around, right? It's why we all remember our first meaningful kiss. All of us do, right? Because those things stick,
yeah.
And when I grew up, like I said, my folks split when I was 5, and we had lots of families come in and out, different stepchildren and step siblings come in and out. So I became very comfortable with uncertainty because I had to be. I had to be comfortable building these emotional ties and then seeing these emotional ties drift away for no reason that I could deal with because it wasn't under my control. So being comfortable with uncertainty now has become part of my way of living. Because you experience that catastrophic uncertainty when you were 13, the yen to figure out certainty and feeling uncomfortable with certainty, I can imagine that persisting for decades.
Yeah. That's a really interesting thought. And it,
And then you master it, right? And then what happens, what I think is so interesting, Scott, is that you start controlling the uncertain environments.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that has happened over the years is rounds and rounds of layoffs at the place that I work. And I've seen some really great scientists come and go, not by their own choice. Well, some by their own choice and some not by their own choice. And living with that job uncertainty was certainly, especially earlier in my career, was a hard thing to master. I'm so late in my career now that it doesn't bother me anymore. It does bother
Sure.
me to see good people get laid off, but the uncertainty of job security is something that's in the past for me, which thankfully
Mm-hmm.
I can say that.
Thankfully. Now, going through all that career as a scientist, you mentioned you work with brilliant scientists and smart people who come in and out. Were there mentors in your life that were particularly profound in your journey?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm really glad you asked that question. I did graduate studies at UC Davis, and there I met my advisor, my PhD advisor. He was not only a strong mentor figure, he was a little bit of a father figure. I think that um, I don't think he really knows this, but I perhaps was using him is the wrong word, but thinking of him as a substitute father figure at the time. And he really wasn't
Mm-hmm.
that much older than I was, but he knew so much more about this science that I really wanted to master. And so he was a young assistant professor, and he would go into the lab and show me things and teach me things, and not just talk about science, but talk about the mental fortitude that we all needed to get through our PhD programs, and how to instill that mental fortitude, and how to have fun. And he got me hooked on coffee. It's one of the interesting. And I still love coffee to this day. But yeah, he definitely was. When you talk about mentor figures, he was probably one of the strongest mentors in my life that helped me grow as a person, as a scientist. Yeah, my graduate career at UC Davis was, I would say, one of the best times in my life, the most formative time that I grew
Mm,
from a pretty shy kid to a professional that was able to speak about my work in front of people with only a little bit of butterflies at the beginning, but then being really comfortable once I got started.
that's
And
confidence,
I
right?
was,
And
yeah.
and what's interesting is that I don't know what it's like for lady folk, but for men folk, I believe we seek out father type figures or what I would call models of manhood. Sometimes the model of manhood is your father, sometimes it's not. Sometimes, way back in Wayback Machine, you'd have apprentices like a printer's apprentice, right? Or a baker's apprentice. And
Mhm.
they'd leave the family, and suddenly that baker's apprentice would latch onto that baker as a father figure. That's just an easy transference. I can completely understand how you would, especially getting into this really interesting young adulthood time, if you didn't see your father a lot, there were still some unanswered questions. Having that presence that was stable, that was helping you grow, makes a lot of sense. And I think we imbue a lot of that role onto somebody. And he might not have even wanted the role, but we put the role on them, right? And so as you started to go through that and having that powerful mentor in your life, you can see why that's probably one of that springboard moment of your life that transforms the rest of your life. Not
Mhm.
just the science that you learned, but the relationship that you developed with your mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So as you go through, I'm sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to ask is that, there's so many questions about what you guys talk about in the field of science, right? Because there's the science itself, but in the end of the day, if you're not an academic or a pure researcher, you use your science in a business environment.
Mhm.
Did he talk about that, or as you learned to figure out the balance of the science and the business of science?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that um, I didn't learn it from my graduate career in that academic environment. I had no clue what the business of science was going to entail. But now that I've been in the business of science for 20 plus years, one of the things that I didn't realize at the time that I now sort of want to communicate to you and to others maybe listening is that in the pharma industry, which is the industry that I'm in, um, it's it's a pretty rough and tumble business environment, just like any business. So I don't mean to differentiate it between other businesses, but the rough and tumbleness that I've experienced is massive amounts of money can be won and lost within shorter periods of time than I would say the average business. And that's because of this thing called a patent cliff, as well as not being able to predict very well, what the uptake of a certain pharmaceutical product is going to be in the marketplace by insurance companies and so on. And so those were the things that I learned about the business of science that have very little to do with science itself and the discoveries that we make. And so
Hmm.
the balance between how I balance that in my life, because again, that uncertainty of, is this going to become a product or not? And how much money is it going to make? is that my team and I have been able to put some really good, what I would call bricks into the wall of science, and these nuggets of knowledge through publications and patents that no matter if what I work on makes it to be a drug or not, I know that I've contributed to that great wall of science that may be useful to somebody someday.
We'll be right back.
Yeah, so just to catch up where we left off, the one thing about the business of science and the science that I do is, I'll just reiterate, we have two things that are unusual about the large pharma industry, which is we have patent cliffs, and then we have poor predictions on what the uptake of a particular medication might be, and this results in very quickly making uh, tons of revenue, but also losing it during patent cliffs or unexpected uptake of various products. And where that balances out in terms of my mind with sort of the pure science end of things is, um, irregardless of whether we have a product at the end of the day, my team and I can be really proud of the building blocks. I call them, bricks in the wall of science that we've put in place, these little nuggets of knowledge that are going to go forward even past when I'm gone, as publications and patents that are useful to other people. And so, would I like the business to be successful, and would I want to be successful in terms of the business of science? Yes, of course. But it's, I've been at this over 25 years now, and I still do not have a product that I worked on the market yet. I have a couple things in clinical trials, but it's a totally different business model than, say, software development, where the product cycles are very quick. But
Mm-hmm.
my team and I can be proud of these bricks of knowledge that we've put into the walls of science, and so I
I
hope
love
that
that.
answers your
And
question.
it does. I love that purposeful approach that you take where I would say it's ironic. I find it really interesting that in a quarter century of work, the scientific work that you've done for a business hasn't yet hit market. However, in your own work, you've pushed science forward. And isn't that the job of science, right? Everybody stands on the shoulders of the next person behind them to move us forward in a scientific way. But I must imagine that that career was pretty intense, right? And you had mentioned that, you and your wife are committed to your families because you both are children of divorce. And so you're committed to making sure that your family stays intact. That must have been challenging, though, right? Trying to manage a career in science and be present as a dad. My dad worked long, long hours, and it had a profound effect on me. So the career choice that I made was one so that I'd be home for dinner pretty much every night. I took the kids to school or the bus stop every day. I was actively engaged in all their activities in school. I volunteered right in the art program for them, so I was present. But the career choice that I made, and I could have done better in terms of a like quote unquote career path, right, with more money or more title, etc. But it was important for me to have that balance in my home life because especially based on how I grew up in my relationship with my own dad. How did you balance that out? How did you navigate that um, path of career growth and being a active and engaged father in the family?
Yeah, great question. But let me first acknowledge, that I really admire and respect your choices to, you know, purposefully make choices that you could be home as much time as you felt you needed to be home for. So that's really cool. I admire that. For my immediate family, Tanya and I had more of a traditional. When I say traditional, I'm thinking back to like the 1950s, maybe more of a traditional division of labor. But it wasn't as extreme as your father. For example, you mentioned he had worked like 80-hour weeks. I think I've, over my career probably averaged 45 to 50-hour weeks. So nothing
Mm-hmm.
crazy. There have been times, in terms of the science of what I do, that I need to go in on weekends. I went in this morning to check a reaction where, for safety reasons, I just need to go in and check it daily because I'm basically heating hydrazine, which is a component of rocket fuel. And luckily, I'm heating it under a nitrogen atmosphere, not oxygen, because the mixture of hydrazine and oxygen is what powers space shuttles and things like that. So anyway, the,
I'm
the,
glad you're
the,
checking that data. Well done. Good job.
the nature of my science is such that I did work odd hours at times, and being in the lab is sometimes requires that. But it was nothing crazy, but looking back at the way we handled those things, and sort of like through um, my time in recovery right now, I am doing a lot of looking back. Um, I'm being more retrospective or introspective on some of the things I might have missed out on. Um, I would say I don't have strong regrets, but I do feel like I need to play a little bit of catch up in terms of getting a little bit closer to my children, as they go through adulthood. Because I can tell I'm a little jealous of my wife's strong bond with them. They don't have that same. They have a strong bond with me, but maybe not as strong as with my wife. And so I think I have some work to do to
Mm.
catch up from some of the times and things I missed. I was the dad that played with the kids and did all the fun stuff, and danced with them and threw them around and jumped threw them in the air, and
Hmm.
Tanya did a lot of the lion's share of the rearing, maybe the hard work, the heavy lifting. So
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to try to reconcile that. And you can't get back the time, but being there for the hard work now of uh, raising young adults, it's an odd thing because you don't necessarily actively raise them, but you hope to drop some of those pearls to that they can pick up. You just mentioned something that I want to ask about. You just said that you were in recovery. Um,
yeah,
so what's that about?
yeah. So tying it back to your earlier question, there were times in my career I did keep odd hours, and I would I would sometimes stay late at work. Um, and I was 43 at the time. Um, I started using the excuse to stay work at late to go drink at a bar. Um, I
Hmm.
was I was sort of at that point in life where I had just spent, a lot of time in school, 9 years raising kids, being a good dad, and I was looking for more excitement. I was looking for, to break out of the boredom and relieve some stress from the work that I was in. And at first, it was just, maybe on a Friday night, I'd go to the bar and have a couple of beers before going home. But that led me down a path of more frequent drinking and going to bars after work. Um, and it became a problem in both my, what I would say, healthy living, and as well as my marriage. And
Mm.
I was in and out of recovery for a while during that time between ages 43 and 59. But at age 59, it was on my oldest daughter's birthday. Something happened I don't know what to call it, except that it was an awakening. And I thought I woke up after a night of like moderate drinking, and I thought to myself, what would it be like if I just stopped altogether? And I knew I needed help to do that. So I did. October 20th, I started seeking help, and now I'm part of a fellowship of sober brothers. We call them Sobros,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a wonderful fellowship. And I'm learning that I don't need to drink to have fun. That I can still go to a Padres great game and really enjoy the game without drinking. And so October 20th was about six months ago, and it's been a really interesting 6-month journey for me that I'd be happy to talk more about.
Wow, congratulations on that. And yeah, I'd like to ask you about that journey. I think that you said you were in your mid 40s to, late 50s, and there is the cliche of a midlife crisis, right? For men, especially. I don't know if it's biological or hormonal, or like you said, you had been doing something for 20 years and kind of on a track, and there's a question of purpose. There's a question of direction. What I had been doing, what am I doing now? Where am I going? There's that Talking Heads song, "Letting the Days Go By," which is perfect, right? It's like this song, like, how did I'm driving this Cadillac? How did I get here? And you look around and you're like, Verta Ferk, right? What is this? And I think that, I guess one question that I have is, and I'll get to my question after a definition. The midlife crisis is a phrase, but I was thinking about it, Scott, and I don't like the word crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I'm not exactly what word I want to say, but crisis actually to me implies, I guess it's appropriate, but it applies this tension. And I don't know if this is true or not, but it's this tension of the sense of who we've become versus maybe who we've thought we would become. Right. And if there's a tension or a gap between, I thought I'd be this person or this stage right now, but I'm not. I'm this other thing. And some folks are in alignment. Most folks aren't, right? It's a surprise when you go through life. So talk to me about that tension, because, to make a choice to say after work, I'm going to go have a beer at the bar versus I'm going to drive home and have beers in front of my wife. That's a choice that you made, right? You clearly knew that going home and saying, "Hey, honey, I'm going to come home and I'm going to drink a lot of beer in front of you." You were like, "I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to a bar and drink
Mm-hmm.
because I don't want to show this piece of me." But
Wow.
why don't you describe for us that tension that you felt?
Wow. Okay. I That tension involved, I think, a part of me that you actually touched upon and saw in me in our preamble to this conversation, which was my solitary nature, or my need to
Mm-hmm.
have solitary time. And I think that is part of the root of where that tension came from. And it's embarrassing me, or shameful for me to think to tell you this, but I'm learning to be honest while I'm in recovery and really talk through these things with other men. I had fantasies about leaving my family and getting an apartment downtown San Diego and living the single life again.
Hmm.
And was that what I really wanted, or was that part of this sort of like my need to find solitary time? And I'm still sort of examining that question that I just asked of myself. Why was I why was I thinking that way? I'm happy to say I'm not thinking that way any longer. I'm really happy with where I'm at and at peace. But there was that midlife time where I almost wanted to jump out of my skin and try to be another person.
Yeah, there's a book that I'm reading now. It's by the woman who made the website called Introvert Dear, and she wrote a book called Sensitive.
Hmm.
And it got me to understand different folks in my life who are more of a sensitive nature.
Hmm.
And there are introverts and there are people who are sensitive who need physical alone time to recharge and process and actually get through life. And that solitary needs help certain people recharge. When you are surrounded by scientists in a pressure filled environment where you're looking at patent cliffs and you have lots of money coming in and out that are at stake, and you're trying to raise a family, and you're trying to be the major breadwinner, there's no room for solitary time. There's no room for you to do that. And then also the guilt that comes with that to say, gosh, I need to be alone. But here's my wife who's doing the lion's share of rearing our children. And in the thick of it, am I going to completely not be there for her and for that moment? And again, be this guy and this dad who's detached from the family situation. So you've got to get in, even though what you actually need is more time alone
Hmm.
to recharge and to be better for everyone. Um, and so I think that is that sense of figuring out your alone time is really key. And I think in that midlife area, some men are look around and say, "Gosh, this is maybe how I have to go." There's this fantastic, I think it's a Sondheim musical called Into the Woods.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. Are you familiar with it?
We're fans. Yeah. Especially Tanya.
Big fans of Into the Woods.
Yeah.
And it's basically, if the audience doesn't know, it's taking those children's stories and Grimm's Brothers fairy tales, but really playing it into adult life. And the first act is more what you would expect, but the second act is really what happens in adult life in the woods of adulthood. And there's this old man who says, kind of running away, let's do it, meaning I'm getting off the grid, I'm out. And my dad said that one time. He was like, there are times when that piece really struck home to him because he's like, I want to get out, right? I need this solitary space. I need to go. So that makes a lot of sense to me. That the tension that would exist would be how you figure out and navigate these two seemingly opposite desires
Hmm.
to be in the thick of your family life, but needing solitary time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I would say to that is that I've found through meditation, morning solitary time, and that's been a long practice of mine even before I was, serious about my recovery. But now it's, both meditation and prayer. Um, and I think there's a spiritual component of my recovery that was missing
Hmm.
those 16 years when I was sort of struggling through whatever you call it, a midlife upheaval. I also don't like the
Mm-hmm.
word crisis because crisis usually means an immediate, short term um, occurrence. But mine was not short term. It was a long drawn out. Uh, what do you want to call it? A period in my life that that I'm not proud of, but I guess I had to go through it.
Mm-hmm. And better for it. So, with that, I know a lot of recovery programs do have the introduction of a higher power. You mentioned there's a spiritual path on that. I'm a big believer in personal faith journeys. In another episode, I talked. There's church, there's religion, which is huge. There's church, which is local, and there's faith, which is private. Some
Mhm.
people have it that aligned really well. Some people don't. Um, what is your faith journey now, Scott?
Yeah, it's I think a strong component of my faith journey involves fellowship. So, Chris, you're sort of the leader of our swimming pod, right? And we've had a great fellowship there.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm developing friendships with the young men in my recovery, and we get together and talk about deep things like this conversation, that you're having as a podcast, which is wonderful, by the way. We get together and we talk about deep things, and we're vulnerable. And so my spiritual journey right now is definitely not traditional. I'm not attending church, any specific church at the moment, but I like to think of it as, especially as a scientist, there's a lot of things we don't know about the universe. What started this big bang and this ball rolling, and what powers are sort of like um, controlling the energetics of the universe. And
Hmm.
it's those are the larger questions, but at the end of the day, I think it's a fellowship and a love amongst um, fellows who are going through similar things, and love of family. And those are the sort of the foundations of my spiritual journey right now.
No, I think that's wonderful. I think that the faith in other people and drawing faith from other people for some folks can be just as powerful as a faith in higher power. And it could be that the higher power is the collective energy and love of other people.
Yeah.
Why not? It could be.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll ask you, Scott, in closing, what do you think is next for your journey? Right, you and wife are empty nesters in a way, and you've got this beautiful pocket of time ahead of you where there's less of a stress of career uncertainty, um, more of a vision of who you want to be in this next long last arc of your life. Have you thought about that?
I think a lot about it. Yeah, pretty much every day. The big question of when to retire and what to do in retirement years occupies a lot of my thought and conversations with my wife. So that's the next big thing. And I love my job so much right now that I'm definitely putting off any hard and fast decisions right now, and I'm just toying with those ideas in kind of a playful and peaceful way, um, which is interesting for me to say because I've always been a planner. Like I'm gonna get my undergraduate degree and take a few years off, go to graduate school, and get a job in the pharmaceutical industry. I've always sort of like mapped out portions of my life. Having kids was always part of the plan. Um, this retirement stage is I don't have it mapped out, which is bringing
Mm,
up that uncertainty that we were talking about earlier.
yeah.
Yeah, it is something to another topic for another menfolk journeys, I guess.
Yeah, it is. I think it's true because how you prepare your next stage when your physical hours in a career aren't there, what you do with that time. It's interesting. I just spoke with a man who said, don't squander your time. It's all you've got. Everybody's got the same 24 hours. And again, that's another cliche, but it's true. Everyone's got the same 24 hours. And so I think the question is what you do with those 24 hours in terms of having it be purposeful, having it be beneficial to others, right?
Hmm.
That's a good question. So I've
Yeah.
got a final question for you, Scott.
Okay.
Who do you know that I don't know that I should meet?
Oh, that's a good question. I would love for you to meet my sponsor. Uh,
Yes.
that would be really cool. He's a great
That'd be
guy.
great.
He has for as young as he is, he's a lot younger than me. He's got some pearls of wisdom that are just pretty amazing. So that's one person.
Wonderful. Well, I'd love to get the chance to meet him. And Scott, I can't thank you enough for being a part of this. I think you're an extremely brave man. And, having conversations like this hopefully gets other people to think of their own lives. But for you to be vulnerable and to share what you've gone through and to share your story, and your story which is one of bravery. And I really appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks, Chris. I really appreciate what you're doing here, and I think it's just a needed and very much appreciated thing that more men should tune into.
Wonderful. All right, brother.
Okay, we'll see you. Have a great day.
Right on, Scott. What a brave man to share that story like that. His past growing up, the way he decided to move along faster than one might when they're a kid. And what a brave man to share that story of his challenges and his recovery and his faith journey. So what did we learn today from Scott? I think we learned that there's a science of uncertainty. How we handle uncertainty, our preparation for it, our comfort level with it, that can change over time. The more we feel confident about what we can do, I think the more comfortable we can be with uncertainty. To know that we've mastered certain skills that can prepare us for the unknown. But what greater unknown than a faith journey? Unique and private, and you move on that path. You want to share it with other people, but in the end, it's your own faith journey. That is a beauty of solitude. And that is a beauty of finding out who you want to be when you're by yourself. Well, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please tell other people about it. And please visit menfolkjourneys.com. On the website, you can look at a conversation start, kind of a guide, and you can also book a conversation. He did. He listened to one podcast and said, "Chris, I think I'm ready to come onto your podcast and tell my story." And I'm so glad he did, because we can all learn from him and we can all be better for it. And that's the name of the game. Let's get better together. Thank you so much. Word bid Flarid.